2015, 18-year-old Dalen Pua was visiting his grandmother on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Dalen, who was a Hawaiian native himself, didn't spend much time in Oahu with his grandmother, and since he was here, he figured he would do the one thing he had always wanted to do, which was to climb the island's very famous and very illegal haiku stairs, or better known as the Stairway to Heaven. These stairs were a very narrow, rusty, not well-maintained 4,000-step staircase that weaved its way up the side of this Hawaiian mountain. It was built during World War II by the United States Navy because they wanted access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and it was not well maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987 and literally put a fence up and even put guards out to keep people from going in. But Dalen really wanted to do this. So that morning he tells his grandmother that he's thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. And his grandmother's like, that's a horrible idea. Not only is it dangerous, but they're going to fine you thousands of dollars if they catch you doing that. Dalen backed down from what he said and he said, okay, I won't go. And he kind of played it off like, I'm not going to go on this hike. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and he made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal and he was incriminating himself, he was so excited about going on this hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. And so the first picture begins with him at the base of the stairs where he posts a picture as he's about to start this hike. And then all morning he's taking pictures along the way up these 4,000 stairs. But then around 11 a.m. that morning, the posting stops abruptly and he hasn't reached the summit. And you figure if you're going to do this hike and you're already posting pictures of just the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you're going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post all of those because that's the prize at the end of this hike. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly hadn't reached the summit yet. And by that night, when he didn't come home, the family was really concerned and they told police. Police launched this huge search for him. They're looking all over the stairs. They got helicopters out. The Navy gets involved. There's no sign of him. He's just vanished. When they couldn't find him after several days, they had to call the search off, and the assumption was, well, you're doing something dangerous. There's a reason this is off limits. He probably slipped at some point and fell down the mountain. That's why this is off limits. It's not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something in this picture. This shot looks like he's just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down a little ways down the trail that appears to be hiding. And many people believe that that guy was following Dalen and at some point attacked him. That Dalen didn't fall off the mountain, he was abducted or killed. To this day, Dalen has never been found and that mystery man has never been identified. 15th, 2004, two police officers drove down a quiet street in a little English village called Murrow, and they pulled over in front of this little brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a neighbor who lived on this street had called the police to report hearing a strange digging sound coming from inside of this bungalow. And so these officers had been sent out to see what the sound was and make sure the occupants of this home were okay. Now, these two officers were not particularly worried about the occupants of this house. They assumed that some wild animal must have snuck in while the owners were away, and that was all this was. But, as they would quickly learn, that was not the case. After climbing out of their car, the two officers just stopped and listened for a second to see if they could hear this digging sound, but the bungalow was quiet, the street was quiet, and so the two officers shut their car doors and made their way up to the front porch of this bungalow and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, when nobody answered, one of the officers reached down and tried the handle and found it was unlocked. And so he opened the door just a crack and he called out through this opening in the door into the bungalow saying, hey, it's police, we're here to check on you. But when no one called back to them, the officer opened the door the rest of the way, and immediately both officers saw there was a huge problem inside of this house. The entire first floor was flooded with several inches of water, and they could hear from somewhere in the back of the property the sound of running water. And so again, both officers called out into this house to try to get the attention of anyone who might be inside. And when again they were met with silence, the officers walked into the flooded house and began walking straight back towards this running water sound. And eventually, after walking through the living room, they entered this hallway that went right to the back of the property, and as soon as they were in it, they could see there was an open door at the end of the hallway on the left, and it seemed like the running water sound was coming out of that room. And so the two officers, one by one, sloshed down this hallway to this room. They turned left, looked inside, and what they saw completely shocked them and immediately sprung them into action. 2 months before these officers came to this bungalow and found it flooded with water, the owner of this bungalow, 51-year-old Ronald McClagish, had broken up with his girlfriend. And this breakup was really hard on Ronald. He was already divorced. He was totally broke. He had loads of health issues like bad asthma. He had some liver issues. And just generally, he was someone who was kind of physically frail. And so this girlfriend had been one of the very few good things in his life. And now she was gone and he was alone again. And so very quickly after this breakup, Ronald fell into a very dark depression. And so for 6 weeks after they broke up, Ronald, for the most part, just stayed in bed and kind of moped around his bungalow, kind of feeling bad for himself. But then finally, at the end of those first 6 weeks after the breakup, Ronald decided he wanted to get his life back together and just move on. So on February 1st, 2004, so roughly 2 weeks before those two officers would come to his bungalow because of this digging sound, Ronald would wake up feeling determined to start anew. And the first thing he was going to do was purge his bungalow of anything that was his ex-girlfriend's. She left a lot of things behind when they broke up. She had not collected them. And so now they were just kind of sources of pain. And where most of her stuff was inside of Ronald's bungalow was in this closet in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. So that morning, Ronald headed down the hall. He turned left into the bedroom. He opened up the closet. He went inside, and with a trash bag in hand, he began rifling through everything in this closet, and anything that was hers, he would take it and put it right into the trash bag. And at some point, when Ronald was almost done pulling the last few things of his girlfriend's out and into the trash bag, from behind him, he heard this strange sound coming from the bedroom. It sounded like wood bending or creaking, but before he could turn around to see what the sound was, the door to the closet he was in slammed shut with incredible force, and suddenly Ronald was trapped inside of this closet in total darkness. Now, Ronald was likely shocked at first, but he would have reached and tried for the handle and found that no matter what he did, he could not open this closet again. And so Ronald began screaming for help and pounding on the door, but nobody came to help him. The closet that Ronald was in was fairly tall, but it was only 2 feet wide by about 2 feet deep, which meant Ronald could only stand inside of this closet. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't bend down, he literally was trapped standing. And Ronald didn't have water, he didn't have food, he knew that no one was going to be checking on him anytime soon, and even though his bungalow was kind of small and shabby, it was built out of brick. And so the likelihood that his calls for help were penetrating outside loud enough that people could hear them and that they would come in and rescue him was pretty slim. And so at some point that evening, Ronald realized he needed to do something different if he was going to get out of this closet. And so above him were a series of pipes across the ceiling. And so he reached up and he grabbed one of them and he broke it off. He was likely thinking that with this pipe, maybe he can burrow a hole in the wall and crawl through to another room, or maybe he can punch a hole in the door and somehow unlock it, or at a minimum, with the metal pipe, smashing it against the wall or the door would be louder than any noise he could make by yelling. However, the second he broke that pipe off the ceiling, something horrible happened. The pipe he broke was a water pipe, and as soon as it was broken, icy cold water began pouring down directly on top of Ronald's head and face. And again, because he can only stand basically in the middle of this closet, he couldn't get out of the way of this water. It was like he was under a waterfall and couldn't go anywhere. And so he likely tried to ignore the water and tried to use the pipe and screamed and do anything he could to get someone to know he was in here, but no one could hear him. And so it was like he was being tortured with this freezing water, and he's in this tight claustrophobic space. It's total darkness and he's totally panicking. And for days and days,
that would be Ronald's nightmarish reality. But despite how terrible his circumstances were, Ronald continued to use that pipe to both smash the walls to make loud sounds. He also began burrowing into the walls, trying to make a hole. But Ronald was getting weaker and weaker. He became very sick. And also, because the water was constantly hitting his head and face, his skin got so saturated that literally his skin started falling off. It basically opened up into these sores and began to sag, and the water just began brushing his skin off. And so finally, after about a week of being trapped in this closet in these terrible conditions, Ronald realized help was not going to come in time, and so he put his pipe down, he kind of slumped up against the wall, and then closed his eyes. Ronald's neighbor, who called the police, actually did hear Ronald using that pipe to try to dig a hole in his wall, and she heard Ronald smashing the pipe on his door, and she must have heard muffled shrieks and yells, but she didn't know what they were and kind of just decided it wasn't her business. But when Ronald's house went from all these strange sounds to silence, that was when she called the police and said, hey, I had heard some digging sounds coming from the bungalow, and now I don't. And so when those two police officers arrived at Ronald's bungalow, they went inside, they went down the hallway, they went into the bedroom where Ronald had gone, and they saw this huge wardrobe, which is a big wooden piece of furniture, toppled over right in front of the closet. And at the bottom of the closet, they saw two human feet protruding from underneath that little space at the bottom of the closet. Those feet belonged to Ronald. He had managed to force his feet underneath the closet, but of course, he could not have fit underneath the closet door. And so the two police officers rushed over, and together, they barely were able to get this wardrobe off of the closet door. And when they opened the door up, Ronald was in there, he was deceased, his body was still in a standing position, kind of rigid and propped up against the wall, and freezing water was still pouring down onto his head. It would turn out no one had intentionally trapped Ronald. Instead, his wardrobe was just unstable, and it happened to topple over at the worst possible moment.
He was skipping school regularly and hanging out with the wrong crowd. Tyler's parents had tried to do everything to get their son back on track between doctor's visits, psychiatry appointments, medication, an outpatient mental health program, but none of it seemed to work. Tyler just was on the wrong path. As Tyler's behavior continued to get worse as he got older, his parents just didn't know what to do, became very frustrated with him, and became very, very strict disciplinarians. One night when Tyler came home and he appeared to be intoxicated, his parents took his phone and car away, and Tyler was furious. And he confided in his best friend Michael Mandel that he thought his parents had gone over the line, that they were over-disciplining him, and he said to Michael that he wanted to kill his mother. Now, Michael knew Tyler and had known him since he was a little kid, and he did not think twice about this claim that, Tyler wanted to kill his mom. He just thought that Tyler was frustrated with his parents, and Michael did know that Tyler's parents were very, very strict and hard on him. So he just kind of wrote it off. Not long after this incident, Tyler starts talking about this huge house party he's going to have. And all of Tyler's friends, including Michael, just didn't buy it. They're like, there's no way you could ever pull this off. Your parents are too strict and they never leave town anyways. But every time people approached him, he would say, oh no, my parents aren't going to be there. They'll never find out. At some point, Michael gets a Facebook invitation to Tyler's big house party, and he sees that it's been sent to so many people. It's been sent well beyond an inner circle of friends to just total strangers. And then on the Facebook invitation itself, someone had posted on the wall, hey Tyler, what are you going to do if your parents come home? And he responded to that, they won't, trust me. On the day of the party, Michael shows up to Tyler's house and it is packed with people. Lots of people he didn't know, and he was fairly certain Tyler didn't know them either. And he goes inside and it's clear that no one gives a crap about the house itself. People are writing on the walls, people have spilled stuff all over the ground, there's broken glass on the ground, people are rummaging through the food in the fridge. No one cared about the house. And Tyler, oddly enough, didn't seem to mind at all. The only time Tyler became on edge was when he felt like the party was getting too loud. And he would go around and tell people to be quiet because he didn't want his neighbors to hear, because the neighbors would call the police and he didn't want the police coming to the house. During this big party, Tyler pulls Michael aside and says, hey, I gotta tell you something, come outside with me. When they get outside, Tyler looks at Mike and just says, Mike, I killed my parents. Michael doesn't believe him, but Tyler says, no, look in my driveway. Their car is still here. They did not go to Orlando. I killed my parents. Michael still didn't believe him, and Tyler said, "Go inside. I bet if you look around, you'll find blood in my house." So he goes inside and he starts looking around, and when he goes upstairs, he sees there's blood on a table right outside the master bedroom where Tyler's parents slept. And on the door handle to the master bedroom, there was also blood. So he goes back down, and he goes, "Tyler, you're playing a prank on me." And Tyler goes, "No, when the party dies down, I'll show you proof." At this point, Michael is starting to think this could actually be real. And Tyler walks away, and Michael's thinking to himself, I can't wait till the end of this party to see if this is really true or not. So he goes upstairs, goes to the bloody door handle to the master bedroom, opens it up, and the door actually hits the leg of Tyler's father, who's laying on the ground, who's deceased inside of the master bedroom. He shuts the door and he's standing in the hall, and he doesn't know what to do because on the one hand, Tyler's his friend, but he just discovered Tyler's a murderer. He also knew Tyler's parents really well, so he's deeply saddened by what he just saw. And as he's standing there, he's realizing that he has to turn Tyler in. And so for some reason, he just felt the need to take one more picture with Tyler because he knew as soon as he left the house, he was going to go tell authorities what Tyler had done, and he was never going to see him again. And so he goes over to Tyler and he takes this picture. After Tyler was arrested, he admitted that just hours before this house party, he had bludgeoned his parents to death and stashed them in the master bedroom. Tyler was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and while he has been remorseful, he's never given a real reason why he actually killed his parents. Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timisoara. Loana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Loana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Loana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these 2 Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Loana as like the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching, and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, when she had not made a full recovery at all, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Loana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob, and that perhaps she had checked herself out of the hospital too soon, and untreated, that's why she must have passed away early. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies, and on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Loana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Loana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those 2 Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her that led to the mob coming and attacking her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the 2 primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Loana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Loana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing this image, which is of Loana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that they will have bouts of extreme sleep paralysis. These are people that have never had sleep paralysis before, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Loana. And so now that you've seen this image, you're cursed too. So, 1861, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around, he's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders, and for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son, and he puts his son down by a tree, and he sits down next to him, and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is how? Because he couldn't walk until now. And my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree. He picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by presumably his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son. He's not hearing anything. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially, the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. Pelican Valley is a beautiful, remote section of backcountry in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Its meandering meadows and creeks and 360-degree view of the mountains make it appear like the perfect place to camp out under the stars. But unlike other areas of the park, Pelican Valley requires a special permit if you intend to stay the night. And before Yellowstone Park rangers give you this permit, they remind you that Pelican Valley is a very dangerous place. And in general, you should only be out there with groups of at least 4 people. On July 28, 1984, 25-year-old Brigitte Fredenhagen, along with her brother Andreas and her sister-in-law Janko, arrived at Yellowstone National Park. That night, they stayed in one of the park's more established campgrounds called Grant Village. The following day, they headed out to one of the park's famous hot springs called the Norris Geyser. That afternoon, before heading back to their campsite, they made a pit stop at the park ranger's office so Brigitte could apply for a Pelican Valley permit. Her plan was to spend the following night in the valley. When they went in the office, the rangers believed all 3 of them were applying for a permit, and so they weren't asking that many questions. They were just kind of going through the routine. And then when Brigitte said, no, it's just going to be me applying for a permit, they actually immediately tried to dissuade her and said, this is a really bad idea. Nobody goes into Pelican Valley on their own. But Brigitte assured them that she was an experienced camper, she understood the risks, and she still wanted to go on her own. And Andreas and Janko, who were standing behind her, kind of echoed that sentiment and said, no, she's really good. She knows what she's doing. The park rangers were not thrilled with her plan, but they ultimately decided, you know what, if she wants to go, she can go. They just asked her to show them on a map where she intended to camp, so if they needed to, they could come and check on her and make sure she was okay. And so she pointed to a section on the map, and they handed her her permit, and then she, along with Andreas and Janko, left the office and headed back to their campsite. The next morning, the trio got up early and they hopped in the car and drove to the Pelican Valley trailhead. They parked their car, they got out, and they began walking into Pelican Valley as a group. After a few miles, as planned, the group stopped, at which point Andreas told Brigitte that they were going to head back now and that they would meet her tomorrow at the trailhead where they parked the car. They said their goodbyes, and then Andreas and Janko turned around and started walking back towards the car, and Brigitte carried on into the wilderness. The following day, Andreas and Janko arrived at the trailhead to meet Brigitte, but she didn't show up. And after a couple of hours, they grew very concerned, so they called park rangers and asked them, have you seen Brigitte? And they said, no, but we'll go take a look. The area Brigitte had told park rangers she was going to be camping was inside of a densely forested area right next to a large meadow, which meant as park rangers came up to check on her, they would not actually be able to see her until they were practically right on top of her. So the park rangers made their way through the meadow and into the forest before they started yelling for Brigitte, but she didn't yell back, and then at some point they reached the area where she had said she was camping, and sure enough, they found her tent. But it was a very odd scene. When they came up to the tent, they could see there was a big tear in one side. When they poked their heads down and looked inside, all of her belongings in the tent were undisturbed. There was a foam sleeping mat right in the middle, and then to the right of the mat was a flashlight that had been turned off. On the left side of the pad was a tape player with headphones that she must have been listening to before bed. It had been left on until the batteries ran out. At the foot of the pad was her backpack, inside of which were all of her clothes that had been neatly packed inside of Ziploc bags to mask her scent. Also in the pack was a wilderness survival guide with a page flipped down that was a diagram of how to string your food up into the trees so no animals can get to it. The rangers looked around the backside of the tent about 2 meters away, and they found her sleeping bag perfectly flat on the ground as if it had been laid out to dry in the sun. But upon closer inspection, they found it had 2 puncture marks, one that was up near the neck of the bag and the other that was near the torso, but there was no blood on the bag. At this point, rangers started to speculate that this could have been an animal attack, but they were confused at the general tidiness of the scene. Typically, when an animal attacks a person, it looks like a bomb went off in the area where the attack occurred, and this campsite was very, very neat. As the rangers continued to walk around the campsite looking for clues and yelling out for Brigitte, they found a barely discernible drag tail a couple of meters away from the sleeping bag that was leading west into the forest and up a hill. And so the rangers started following this trail, and they got about 20 meters away from the camp when they discovered Brigitte's cooler lying on the ground on its side, and whatever food had been in there was now gone. There was some string laying next to it, so it looked like it had been strung up in the trees, but someone or something had gotten it down. From the cooler, the rangers continue walking along this drag trail another 20 meters or so up a hill, where they discover a woman's sweater on the ground that's been torn up and there's blood on it. So at this point, The Rangers get their rifles up and they keep walking another 40 meters up and over the hill down into this clearing in the woods where they find Brigitte, or what was left of her. No one knows exactly what happened to Brigitte, but the theory based on physical evidence is this. After setting up her campsite, Brigitte climbed inside of her tent, got inside of her sleeping bag, and then put her headphones on to listen to music. A little while later, a male grizzly bear discovered Brigitte's cooler strung up in the trees about 20 meters away. And apparently, Brigitte did not string it high enough because the bear was able to reach up and pull it down. After the bear ate the food inside of the cooler, it was still hungry, so it began looking around the area for more to eat. It's believed this bear was so accustomed to human traffic in the area that when he stumbled across Brigitte's tent, he wasn't scared. In fact, he thought, there's food inside of there. There's people I can eat. So this bear quietly lumbers over to the side of the tent. It reaches up and cuts the nylon with its paw, and then it puts its head inside and bites down on Brigitte's skull and begins dragging her away. There was no sign of a struggle in or near the tent, indicating that Brigitte was most likely asleep, or maybe she just could not hear the bear because she still had her headphones in. She was dragged 80 meters by her skull to that clearing where she was consumed. An attack like this is exactly the reason why Pelican Bay is considered so dangerous, because it's full of grizzly bears. And even though grizzly attacks on humans are incredibly rare, most people do not understand just how horrific they are when they do occur. Grizzly bears don't really try to kill their prey before they eat them. Instead, they focus on pinning them down and then getting them under their body weight so they can't go anywhere, at which point they can eat them at a leisurely pace. Some say grizzlies actually prefer to eat their prey while they're still living, which is why so often in grizzly attacks you see the arms and legs eaten first and then the head and torso. This is a method that keeps the victim alive a little bit longer. Unfortunately, there was so little left of Brigitte that investigators could not pinpoint a time of death. However, because this bear broke normal behavior and intentionally targeted a human, there's a good chance he savored that meal. Porco and his wife, 54-year-old Joan Porco, were like so many other middle-aged, middle-class Americans. They lived in Del Mar, New York in a comfortable 2-story home, and they worked for a living. Peter was an appellate court clerk and Joan was a speech pathologist. They had been married for over 30 years and they had 2 sons. Christopher was a 21-year-old student at the University of Rochester, and his brother, Jonathan, was a 23-year-old naval officer stationed at a submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. On Monday, November 15th, 2004, Peter woke up to start his typical Monday morning work routine. He got up, he got out of bed, he went into the bathroom, he relieved himself, he looked in the mirror, he shaved, he got dressed in his work clothes, he went downstairs, he put on a pot of coffee. While the coffee was brewing, he unloaded the dishwasher and then put the dirty dishes into the dishwasher and started it. He wanted to get his newspaper, so he went outside, he got his newspaper, but he realized he locked himself out of the front door, so he got the spare key out from underneath the mat, opened the front door, went inside, he sat down, had some coffee, read the newspaper. After a few minutes, he put his coffee cup in the sink, he packed himself a lunch in his lunchbox, and then he headed for the door to head for work. Peter was known as a very reliable employee who was also very punctual and rarely missed work. So when he didn't get to work that Monday morning, the court was a little bit confused. They called him to see if he was okay. He didn't pick up. So they dispatched a court officer to go make sure he was okay. And so the officer arrives at his house. He sees cars in the driveway, the front door shut. He goes up, he knocks on the door. Nobody answers. He tries the handle of the front door. He realizes it's open. So he opens the door and he yells out, "Hey, I'm just looking for Peter." And the door hits something on the ground. He pokes his head inside and looks down, and there on the ground, the thing blocking the door, is Peter Porco's body. He's clearly deceased, and he clearly has a massive head wound. The court officer steps outside immediately, calls 911, local police show up, they go inside, and sure enough, Peter is dead. They go upstairs and they find his wife, Joan, in bed, also with a massive head wound, but she was still alive. Joan was rushed to a hospital where she underwent emergency surgery and then was put into a medically induced coma. Meanwhile, the police began their investigation into who could have done this. They quickly discovered that the home's alarm system had been smashed and a phone line, because there still was landlines at the time, had been cut from the outside, and a screen in one of the windows had been slashed that looked like the way someone climbed into the house. However, nothing appeared to have been stolen because police almost immediately found Peter's wallet with money inside of it still sitting in the house, as well as very expensive jewelry that belonged to Joan still sitting in the house. As they continued to search the house, they discovered a fireman's axe that belonged to the Porcos hidden inside of one of the bedroom closets, and it was very clear this was the murder weapon. The Porco sons had been away during this attack. John was on his submarine in Connecticut, and Chris was at the University of Rochester. And in fact, Chris found out about the attack on his parents when he saw a news report. Because this story of this innocent, typical-seeming American couple in a quiet suburb getting struck down by some axe-wielding maniac had gone totally viral, and it was all over the news. And so Chris called the police to get more information about his parents' death. Here's the recording.
Hi, my name is Chris Porco. I was just called by the Times-Union saying that my parents were found dead this afternoon. I was wondering if you had any information on me.
Hey, Chris, whereabouts are you?
I'm at school in Rochester, New York.
Okay, you're in Rochester?
Yes.
Okay, and you're hearing from the Times-Union?
Yeah, they said my parents were found, I guess, I don't know, they didn't say how or anything.
So you will be here probably, you're going to go right to Albany Med?
I don't know, I don't even know where my mom is, but...
Yeah, she is at Albany Med.
Okay, do you know her condition?
No, because I haven't talked to her. Let me give you my pager number.
As you can tell, Chris is extremely emotional. He's beside himself. He can barely speak. He's so upset about what's happened to his parents. No, actually, he sounds as calm as if he's ordering a pizza, because Chris Porco was actually a psychopath, and he was the one who attacked his parents with the axe. As it turns out, Chris was failing at school and taking out huge loans in his father's name by forging his signature, and his father found out about it. So Mr. and Mrs. Porco write their son a strongly worded email where they tell him this behavior has to stop, and they're very disappointed in him, but they love him and they will help him get back on his feet. Chris responded by driving home in the middle of the night, sneaking into his house and attacking his parents with an axe. While this case is already disturbing and horrific and tragic, it's what happens to Chris's father after the attack that makes it one of the most brutal cases of all time. After being struck 16 times in the head and laying unconsciously in his bed as his son snuck out of his house, Peter suddenly sat up and began his morning routine. He got dressed, he went to the bathroom, he shaved, he went downstairs, he made coffee, he did his chores, he went outside to get the newspaper, he got locked out, he got the key from under the mat, went back inside, he packed his own lunch. When he was finally ready to go, he headed for the door and then he collapsed and he died. Due to the severity of Peter's head wound, his brain was basically broken and it was unable to recognize he had been gravely injured. So in his final moments, he believed it was just a typical Monday morning going about his work routine, when in reality, he had a gaping head wound and he was basically dead after the 16th blow to his head. One of the more surprising and heart-wrenching details of this case is that Joan Porco, she did survive the attack. And after she came out of that medically induced coma, she said she forgot all the details of the attack, even though when she was discovered in her bed, she did indicate that Chris, her son, was the attacker. Nonetheless, she got together $250,000 to post Chris's bail, and she allowed him to come stay with her during his trial. And the two attended the trial together, walking into the courthouse hand in hand. Chris was very quickly found guilty of killing his father and attempting to kill his mother, and he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Despite the verdict, Joan Porco still speaks to Christopher over the phone and frequently visits him in prison. It's unclear if she still believes he is innocent. So that's going to do it, guys. 15, a 27-year-old Texas man named George Pickering III suffered a massive stroke. He was immediately admitted to a hospital where he was put on life support, and then doctors delivered some bad news to his family. It would turn out George was brain dead, and they advised the family that realistically they should consider pulling George off of life support because it wasn't going to do him any good. George's family was totally devastated by this news. In fact, George's father was so upset he just left the hospital altogether. And so in his father's absence, George's mother and brother wound up talking to doctors and saying that yes, we are prepared to pull George off of life support. After they consented to have this done, they put George on an organ donor list and then began making funeral plans. When George's father came back to the hospital later that day and found out his family had consented to have George pulled from life support, he was furious. He did not believe his son was just totally brain dead and there was no hope. He felt like they should at least try to give him a little bit more time to potentially give them a signal that he was okay. But George's mother and brother told George's father that they had spoken to the doctors and there was just no hope. There was no reason to delay this process. It was time. But George's father was totally not having it. He stormed out of the room and he found the doctors and he demanded they keep his son on life support just a little bit longer. But the doctors told him there really is no reason to do that. And in fact, all you're doing is jeopardizing the people that need his organs, that are waiting for this organ transplant. And so really what we need to do is actually expedite taking him off of life support, because that's the best thing to do right now. George's father was so upset, totally distraught. He ran back to his son's room. He laid over his son and he just held his hands and stared at him and just prayed that his son would give him some sign that he was actually not brain dead, but his son didn't. And before long, the doctors began filtering into the room to begin the procedure of removing his son from life support. And when they came in the room, George's father kind of snapped. He ran out of the room, he ran out of the hospital, he went out to his car and he got his gun, and then ran back into the hospital, back into his son's room, and aimed the gun at the doctors and ordered them to stop what they were doing and leave the room immediately. And so the doctors had not actually begun removing George from life support, so he's still on life support. And so once the doctors and everyone left the room, George's father walked over, he locked the door, and then for the next several hours, he just kept his gun aimed at the door as he laid over his son and just kept looking down in hopes that his son would give him some sign that he was not brain dead. And so finally, when the SWAT team arrived and was stacking up outside the door in the hallway, they began yelling into the room for George's father to put the gun down and let them come in. And George's father the whole time is just looking down at his son, hoping and praying that his son is just going to do something. And right as the SWAT team kicks in the door and comes into the room, George's father had reached down and grabbed his son's hand, and his son squeezed his hand back. And as soon as his father felt that, he dropped the gun and he surrendered peacefully to the SWAT team. And then the SWAT team put George's father on the ground, and as he's being detained, George's father is yelling for the doctors to come in the room. My son is okay. And sure enough, when the doctors came in the room, George was okay. He was moving his hand, his eyes were open, he was making good eye contact, and before long, he made a totally full recovery. He would later be told that had his father not stepped in when he did and bought him those extra few hours on life support, George would have died. As for George's father, he was ultimately sentenced to 10 months in prison for his aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, but he and the rest of his family think what he did was certainly worth